Hello, everyone. Thank you again for coming to this UKSPS seminar. Today, it's our pleasure to have Dr. Elissa Redmiles, who is a faculty member and a research group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems. She uses computational, economic, and social science methods to understand the user's security, privacy, and online safety-related decision-making processes. Her work has been featured in popular press publications such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Scientific American, Rolling Stone, Wired, Business Insider, and CNET, and has been recognized with multiple paper awards at Usenix Security and ACM-CCS. Dr. Redmiles has additionally served as a consultant and a researcher at multiple institutions, including Microsoft Research, Facebook, the World Bank, the Center for Democracy and Technology, and the University of Zurich. Today, she will tell us the story about learning from the people, responsibly encouraging adoption of contact tracing apps. I will pass the stage to you.
Thank you, and thanks for the kind introduction. So today I would like to talk about how we get people to adopt contact tracing apps and how we do it ethically. And the work that I'll present is part of the COVID app adoption project, which I led with a number of collaborators listed here and also listed on the following slides. If you'd like to learn more about the work or look for additional information that wasn't shared in the talk, please go ahead and visit our website, which is listed at the top of the screen. Okay, so in general, computational problems, including contact tracing, require constant decision-making. So when we build machine learning algorithms, right, we have to decide things like what features are fair to use in those algorithms. When we build apps like contact tracing apps or other health apps, we have to decide what data is appropriate to use in those apps and which features we should prioritize when we're going to build them, especially in sort of rushed scenarios like the pandemic. And typically it's experts who set the best practices and make these kinds of decisions. So for example, the software engineers or researchers designing machine learning classifiers will determine which features are appropriate to use in them. The folks who are developing contact tracing apps decide what data is appropriate to collect and how the features in those apps should be prioritized for release. And when experts are making these decisions, they're typically trading off costs and benefits. This figure comes from a paper in which the researchers described their decision process regarding whether to release a particular data set that was used for machine learning. And they described that when they were making the decision about whether to release this data set, they were trading off the benefit to public health from releasing the data against the risk to individuals in the data. And they were making sort of a normative decision about whether they thought, that trade-off merited releasing the data. Similarly, we might make other kinds of trade-offs in other settings. But experts don't always agree on the best practices. So for example, they might disagree on what features are appropriate to use in a classifier or whether or not contact tracing apps are appropriate in the first place. Even more importantly, users and experts may disagree. So just because we as experts have a particular view on, the trade-off between a benefit to public health and risk to individuals, that doesn't mean that aligns with the individual's view about the trade-off of their own risk against benefits to public health. This kind of tension between experts' views and end user views is a tension that's existed long before we had the internet or contact tracing apps. apps. This is actually something that comes up in literature on moral philosophy, which is concerned with how you set the rules and norms for societies in general. And moral philosophy literature describes kind of two ethics approaches. One is normative, where experts prescribe best practices, and the other is descriptive, where experts learn from non-expert preference and behavior and infer best practices based on what the general population is already doing. In this talk, I want to describe a descriptive ethics-based approach to trying to develop a technology. And I'll note that generally speaking, we need to kind of balance the normative and descriptive. It's rarely the case that we can use entirely one or the other. In this talk, we'll talk about how we might be able to use descriptive approaches in order to identify like ideal or acceptable functionality for contact tracing apps based on people's preferences and behavior. Okay, so contact tracing apps, the benefit of these apps scales with the number of users, right? And it doesn't scale linearly, it actually scales exponentially. And this chart here on the right is from research done at Oxford, where they were simulating how different levels of app uptake might impact new cases of coronavirus. And basically the main takeaway, right, is that for every person using a contact tracing app, there's exponential benefit. And so as a result, we care quite a lot, we care quite a lot about adoption of these apps. And at the beginning of the pandemic, when these apps were sort of first proposed as a potential mitigation option, people were very focused, experts were very focused in particular, on ensuring that the apps protected user privacy. So there was a lot of effort from the cryptography and system security communities in order to try to ensure that these apps were going to be privacy protective. And privacy is absolutely critical, but most users are not going to adopt an app just because it's private. So even if we meet the privacy bar, that doesn't necessarily guarantee us that anyone's going to use these things. And so the goal of our work was to get potential users to tell us how to get them to adopt these apps. So we wanted to understand what their adoptions considerations were. We then wanted to predict adoption based on the level of quality we could offer them on particular axes. This would help us prioritize features and determine when the apps were ready for release. And then we also want to use the information that we're able to collect from them in order to try to actually improve adoption in the field, for example, through marketing and how we do transparency about the apps as well as how we design them. Okay. So in order to figure out why people might adopt or not adopt these apps, we started by using surveys. And the reason we did this was that we were doing this research in, say, March and April of 2020. And so there were not contact tracing apps kind of yet out. And so we needed to ask people, you know, if one of these things existed, why would you or would you not be considering installing it? And we used a combination of closed answer questions where there's set answer choices, as well as open answer questions where people kind of describe in essay form their reasons for wanting or not wanting to install. And we ran surveys that had at least 4,000 folks in them and that were sampled to be representative of demographics we were focusing on the United States, on age, race, gender, education, and income. And the goal there is to make sure we capture kind of all of the possible reasons that folks might have. Okay, and what do we find out? What we find out is that there are many possible inputs to people's adoption decisions. Privacy is absolutely one of them, but it's not the entire story. So people also care about who is going to be deploying the app, the provider of the app. They care about how the benefits of the app are framed. Is it that it's an individual benefit, like you find out your risk, or is it more of a collective benefit where it's about protecting society? What are the mobile costs? How will it affect my battery life or my data usage? how accurate is it going to be? If I give up my data, is it really going to achieve the benefit that you told me it was going to achieve? And finally, quite related to privacy, some architecture concerns around, will I be able to delete my data? How is it going to be stored? Is it going to be leaked, etc.? Okay, so we'll dig into a few of these a little bit. The first is provider, right? And what we saw when we studied who people would be comfortable with these apps being provided by, what we find is that people are most comfortable with health protection agencies providing these apps. So in this chart, the dark blue bar is folks who are only comfortable with the provider listed, whereas the light blue bar is folks who are comfortable with this provider and other ones. So nearly 40% of people were comfortable with the health protection agency. Next was health insurers, and then we kind of go down from there. The two takeaways here are, one, that people were most comfortable with health-related entities running these apps, and this makes sense within the framework of contextual integrity, which tells us that people are generally more comfortable privacy-wise when they're sharing data with sort of a matching entity. So we're sharing health data for a health purpose with a health entity. That's very, it matches up in my mental model. But the other thing we see here is there's kind of no universal provider that's preferred. One thing I'll note is that colleagues ran this same survey in both Italy and Switzerland, and found that in those countries where there's a bit of a different attitude toward the federal government than in the US, there was kind of majority acceptance of a governmental health protection agency providing these apps. So that's just sort of an interesting cross-cultural note. Okay. So aside from the provider, why else do people want to install these apps? Well, 89% of our respondents said that they wanted to install a COVID app for one of three reasons. One, they wanted to stay informed about COVID-19, and some of these apps did ultimately offer statistics and so on and so forth as part of them. The second reason was they wanted to support the fight against the pandemic. And the final one was that they wanted to protect themselves or their loved ones. So both of these last two, right, all of these really are benefits. And some of these are individual benefits, staying informed, protecting their loved ones. Others are collective benefits like supporting the fight against COVID. Okay, why did people not want to install these apps? Primarily because they had privacy concerns, they had concerns about the cost, or they either didn't believe in COVID or were overwhelmed by it, and they just didn't want kind of one more thing reminding them of its existence. And this was actually equally large reason as privacy concerns. Okay. So we know at this stage, what are all of the considerations people might be thinking about. Some of them, like accuracy and the costs of the apps, were ones that had received less attention than others. But if we want to prioritize what we're going to work on and what we're going to communicate with users about, especially in a pandemic setting, we need to know which of these considerations are most important. And so in order to figure that out, we used a technique called conjoint analysis. Conjoint analysis is a technique that comes out of quantitative marketing research, where it's typically used when a company is releasing a new product to the market. So let's say it's a television, and they want to know what people might be willing to pay for different qualities of pixels, or how good of pixels to put into their television. And so what they'll do is they'll offer people two product options, each with a set of features, and they would have different features on each of them. And people will pick which of those two products or neither they would want to purchase. And this helps them figure out which features of the television are most important and how good they have to be. We want to do the same thing here. We want to know which features of the contact tracing app are most important. And so what we presented to people, again, a scenario survey, these things still weren't kind of widely available, is we said, imagine that there's a mobile phone app intended to help combat coronavirus in the US. Different apps have different benefits and risks and may collect different information about you. Please look carefully at the options below. Each column represents an app with different attributes that will be designed and distributed by a health protection agency. Assume both apps are equally popular. Which one would you choose? And then we showed them two different apps that had different qualities across all of the adoption considerations on the prior slide. You'll notice that we picked just to look at health protection agency apps since those were the ones people were most receptive to, and we had sort of already explored that factor in depth. By running these decision tasks, what we find is that privacy is absolutely an important consideration. So experts were spot on to focus on that, not only for kind of user adoption purposes, but for a bunch of other reasons as well, right? But if we had only focused on privacy, we would have missed about 70% of people's sort of considerations when they're thinking about whether to adopt these apps. And in particular, equally important as privacy to people is how accurate the apps are, by which we mean how good are they going to be at actually detecting exposures. People also cared quite a bit about costs, whether this was mobile data use or battery life. And then lastly, they cared about kind of how you framed the benefits of the app. And that was still sort of a significant piece of their consideration. Okay. When I present those statistics, what I'm saying is this is what sort of the average decision is composed of. Different people value these attributes more or less, and this gives us some context for how we might want to kind of pitch these apps to people. So for example, we found that left-leaning people or Democrats focused more on the accuracy of the app, where Republicans focused more on privacy. This is in line with sort of research we have in general on Republicans emphasizing privacy more. Younger adults cared more about benefits and accuracy, older adults, privacy and mobile costs. And those who are more knowledgeable about COVID, who are maybe already aware of the efforts being undertaken to protect the privacy in these apps, had more focus on accuracy. We have a question in the chat asking kind of how accurate are these apps and how do we know this? This is a very good question. There have been a few very limited field studies, I think particularly in military settings, looking at accuracy and potential like Bluetooth errors. There has not been enough study of the accuracy of these apps. And through conversations with some of the app developers, this is something they realized, say, 6 months after they started deploying them. Originally, particularly from the folks who are making kind of like Apple and Google making the frameworks, there was sort of this perception that like, oh, we'll make this tooling, the public health departments will then build the apps, and the accuracy is sort of their concern. But the problem there, of course, right, is that the tooling and how well, the Bluetooth works and so on and so forth is a critical part of that accuracy. And because we have privacy protections, right, we don't have as easy of a way to compute accuracy. And this was one of the concerns many public health agencies had when they were sort of unsure whether they wanted to collaborate on these types of apps. There have now been a number of different kind of efforts to try to do inference on accuracy, and this is still ongoing, but there isn't like a singular number that I could point you to right now. There are some field studies that if you email me, I'd be happy to point you to afterward. If there's more questions on that, feel free to speak up or add them. Okay, so toward this point, right, at this time, we did not know how accurate the apps were, but we wanted to know how accurate would they need to be for people to be comfortable adopting them, right? How good is good enough for these apps? So again, accuracy, very important. Privacy also very important. So how private does it need to be? How accurate does it need to be? And there was sort of a follow-up question I see in the chat on what's the hazard of deploying a system whose accuracy is unknown or questionable. I think the hazard, and we'll kind of get through this throughout the talk, is that you lose people's trust, right? And this is something that has happened with these contact tracing apps, which is people adopted them. They realized that they didn't necessarily work well, not always because they weren't accurate, but because there was low adoption, right? And when there's low adoption, that means you don't get very many notifications. That was sort of part of it. The other part was, yep, there were bugs in how the parameters were set, how Bluetooth was working, et cetera. They would get notifications they knew to be false. As people get sort of habituated to not trusting these things, even once you make them good, you now have an uphill battle to kind of convince people to use them. That said, we deploy a lot of systems that we don't know how accurate they are, or we don't know how likely they are to fail, right? So even if you think about any digital account you have, when we work with those companies, they don't necessarily have a great model of how likely it is that your account will be compromised in, say, the next year. They have some guesses, but they don't have perfect ground truth on that. So we're always kind of balancing, you know, how much benefit do we think there is from getting the system out the door, given all of the things that we don't know. Okay, so what we want to know is, does the amount of privacy and accuracy in one of these systems predict people's intent to adopt them? And so we, again, surveyed many people. In this case, we used crowd workers, but we checked that their responses were representative of sort of the general population by also doing 1,000 person sample in the general population. And in this case, it was quite similar, the responses. And what we wanted to do was see if we could build prediction models of adoption intent given some quantified privacy and accuracy levels. And basically the idea here is, well, okay, again, this is before these systems were widespread. If the deployment agencies were going to make the choice that, like, we're not going to release until we hit some benchmarks, what would those benchmarks be? Obviously, experts might have opinions as well on the benchmarks, and we would want to kind of combine public health and privacy experts' views along with end user views and optimize for both of those things. Okay, so on the end user side, we have different kinds of sort of accuracy considerations, right? The first is false negatives. And so we want to measure, given some false negative rate, how likely would people be to adopt? We want to control for people's privacy perception, because we know that between privacy and accuracy, that makes up an average of 60% of why someone might install. So if we ignore privacy, we're probably not going to predict adoption intent very well. And so we use an existing tool that we've modified from health risk research in order to assess people's perception of the risk that their data will be leaked. So we said studies show that despite best attempts to protect the data of those who use this app, some people may have information about who they have been near compromised and used for purposes other than the fight against coronavirus. Please indicate on the chart below how many app users you think will have this information compromised over the next year. And this chart, it shows different blocks of frequency along with reference events. And these are reference events of other kind of crimes. So this is often people use the same kind of chart if they're trying to assess people's perception of the risk that of lung cancer or breast cancer, things like that. And in those cases, the reference events might be ones like these, or they might be other, kind of health or life events that people have some perception of. Okay, so people indicate, their assessment of privacy risk. And then we tell them some information about false negatives and ask them about their willingness to adopt. So we tell them, imagine you're exposed to someone who has coronavirus 100 times over the next year. If you do not use the app 1 out of 100 times, public health workers will be able to detect and notify you that you are exposed. If you use the app, some true positive out of 100 times, the app will be able to detect and notify you that you are exposed. Would you install this app? And we varied that true positive rate across enough values that we'd be able to build a prediction model. Okay, for false positives, we did the exact same thing, except we told them a false positive rate. So we said the app is not perfect. If you use the app will correctly notify you every time. So it's perfect on true positives. But the app will also incorrectly notify you an additional false positive times when you were not actually exposed, would you install this app? Again, we varied this false positive number, and each participant saw only one of these scenarios with only one number. So they were very short surveys. And someone had asked what kind of crowd workers these were. These were Amazon Mechanical Turk workers who were screened for quality with a number of different metrics. Okay, and then for privacy, we wanted to double check that people were actually operating based on their implicit assessments of privacy perception, right? So we were using a pre-validated measure, but we wanted to kind of triple check. And so in order to triple check, what we did was we also had a condition where we told people what the privacy risk was, right? And so if we told someone a privacy risk and a false negative rate, then their decision on whether or not to adopt should be the same as someone who had the same assumed privacy risk that we had set and was told the same false negative, right? Like whether it was implicit or whether it was told, you should behave the same. So we had an explicit statement of privacy risk where we said, studies show that despite best attempts to protect the data of those who use this app, some people may have information about who they have been near compromised and used for purposes other than the fight against coronavirus, same phrasing we used before. And then we said, P out of 1,000 people who use this app will have this information compromised. And we gave various numbers. And then we still ask the same like false negative rate question. Okay, so we run lots of these experiments and then we build some prediction models. And what we find is that using just the false negative rate and the implicit privacy assumptions, we're able to build prediction models with about 70% accuracy, which is quite low if you're a machine learning person working on like log data, but is actually very, very high for human data because humans are just not that consistent in the things that they do. And the takeaways that we have are basically that at 50% sensitivity, so you're detecting 50% of exposures, then our confidence interval is above 50%. So a majority of people express an intent to install with 50% or above sensitivity. And we start to dip under a majority of people being willing to install a perfectly sensitive app, right? It detects every single exposure perfectly, but if it has 10% or more false positives, then a majority is no longer willing to install it. So this gives us sort of some ranges on what our cutoff values might be. Okay. And then if we want to check back, right, on whether privacy expectations matter, they improve our prediction accuracy. So that's one indication that they matter. People do have sort of a priori risk perceptions. So on average, this is sort of their perception of the likelihood that their information will be compromised. Again, we don't necessarily have a measurement of this in terms of ground truth, but this is their perceptions. And we find that in the experiments where we just use their implicit privacy presumption and then see what they decide based on a false negative rate, and in the experiments where we told them the privacy risk, we get similar responses. So they're operating similarly, regardless of whether we tell them the privacy risk or they're basing it on their assumed privacy risk. And so that sort of validates that the experiments worked as intended, and we can at least somewhat trust these thresholds. Now, again, this is self-reported behavior, so I wouldn't say you should take the precise numbers we have as exactly correct, but in other studies we've done where we compare real-world behavior and self-report studies, the directionality and sort of the general thresholds are true, even if, say, the 62% adoption is going to be somewhat different in the real world. Okay. So this gives us some ideas of like cutoff values and what things are most important, what features might be most important to emphasize the fact that we should go and evaluate accuracy and be transparent about it, etc. What about the case where we don't know the accuracy, but we're kind of releasing these apps, and so we want to get them to adopt them? How should we go about doing that? One thing that some people bring up is they're like, wait, why are you doing all of this research? You could just pay people. You should just pay them to adopt these apps, and that's the end of it. What we find is that we could pay people, but if we give them incentives like gift cards or even like certain free healthcare incentives. It will change what apps they're willing to adopt, but not how many people will adopt. So what I mean by that is that in the case where there were no explicit incentives, right? The only benefit is sort of intrinsic, you help yourself or you help society. If we compare that to conjoint analyses where we offered people healthcare benefits, things like free insurance premium for a month, or certain numbers of free doctor's visits, et cetera, we see that people are willing to accept apps that have higher mobile data costs. So basically, this is what we call kind of a commensurate exchange. They're willing to take this valuable healthcare benefit and say, okay, I'll pay more for my mobile data because you're giving me something else over here. But they don't lower their emphasis on privacy or accuracy. And there aren't any more people who are willing to adopt. They're just willing to adopt kind of a crappier app. We see the same thing with monetary benefits, although we actually see that one of the costs, battery life, which is something that you can't really be compensated for, right? There's no way to kind of pay you without a lot of effort to make your battery life better. That actually becomes more important. And this aligns with research in economics, where once you start to make things sort of monetary, people think a bit more about like, oh, what exactly am I giving up in exchange for whatever else? So we can't necessarily just run around paying people. And in addition to the fact that it doesn't necessarily help us get more people to adopt, there's a lot of ethical questions inherent in paying people to share their medical data, right? Okay, so we're not going to pay people to adopt, so we're going to have to find some other way. And what we wanted to do was we said, okay, well, we've learned a lot about not only what adoption considerations are most important to people, but we had also learned like that there were certain framings of the benefits that might be more or less appealing, that people cared about privacy, et cetera. Let's go actually see in the real world whether those results hold up and what the ideal sort of advertising message might look like that's both transparent and ethical and also effective at getting people to adopt these apps. And we only did this research with decentralized, like privacy preserving apps that we felt were ethical ones to kind of promote and align with what people were wanting, with the caveat, of course, of not knowing about the accuracy. So in the remainder of the talk, I'll talk about a field study that we did with the state of Louisiana. And so in this field study, we advertised the state of Louisiana's COVID app for them. So we ran their Google Display Ads campaign. And Google Display Ads are the ones that you see when you go and you search on Google. You also might see them on mobile, desktop, etc. Okay. And what we did was we ran 14 different advertising messages to evaluate first the effect of framing the benefit of the app as an individual or a collective good, as well as the effect of having different kinds of privacy transparency and transparency about the type of data collected. So I'm going to walk through kind of the combinations of these messages. So first we tested the collective versus individual good. Collective good was a message that said reduce COVID infections. Individual good was get notified of COVID exposure. Do note that Google Ads has like a character limit, which is why some of these are quite short. Privacy transparency. So we ran some ads that just had that appeal. Then we ran ads that had that appeal and a privacy statement. So it could be very broad, just without harming your privacy. It could be about control. You control the data you share. Or it could be kind of technical. App data stays on your device. And then finally, we tested, well, what if we had an appeal, a privacy transparency, and transparency about the data collection? So in transparency about the data collection, we'd say something like, the app uses information about who you have been near. We didn't run any ads where we just had the appeal and the information about what data is collected without privacy transparency, because we felt that that would unduly kind of push people away from adopting the app. And we were running this in the real world. We ran this campaign right when the app was released. And so we didn't want to give people false impressions about the application. Okay, so what did we find? We looked at, so what did we analyze? First, we analyzed the click-through rates on our ads. And when people clicked on the ad, they got taken to download the app. And so what we find is that the collective good appeal was significantly more effective at getting people to click to download than the individual good appeal. And this answered a question that had been raised not just in the space of COVID apps, but in the space of what are called pro-social behaviors, things like mask wearing, app adoption, et cetera. In general, there was sort of a public policy debate going on about whether or not these kind of collective goods appeals were better than the individual good appeal. The second thing we find is that the privacy and data transparency statements work differently depending on how you frame the app. So if the app was framed as being a collective good, then all of the privacy transparency statements made our messaging even more effective. And our hypothesis for this is that prior research shows that in collectivist settings, people are extra concerned about their individual privacy. And so our various privacy transparency statements may have reassured them. On the other hand, when we framed the app as being an individual good, the privacy transparency statements either had no effect, or in the case of the technical statement, app data stays on your device, it had a significant negative effect on people's likelihood to click. And our hypothesis there is that people do what's called privacy calculus when they're making individual privacy decisions. So they trade off the individual benefit to themselves versus the privacy cost to themselves. And by making a statement about privacy, prior research shows that you're increasing the salience of privacy. And so we may be kind of artificially throwing off that privacy calculus that they're doing because they already sort of thought through it in a different way than they did in the collective setting. On the other hand, the data transparency statement makes the individual good ads more effective and the collective good ads less effective. And our guess here is that when you're doing this individual privacy calculus, you're already thinking about the fact that you're giving up, your data for your own individual benefit. And people may be overgeneralizing. And in some of our later qualitative work, we do find that people are overgeneralizing what data they're giving up. And so we're sort of scoping it back by saying, here's the data that gets collected. In the case of the collective good case, we're extra reminding you that you're giving up kind of individual data, which might not have been front of mind for you when you were thinking about the fact that I'm gonna fight the fight. I'm gonna reduce COVID cases. And oh, right, I'm not gonna give up too much privacy because you reassured me. Now you're reminding me that I have to give up my individual data about who I've been near. It's a very different kind of calculus than you have in the individual good case. So this is sort of one of our key takeaways here, both for contact tracing apps, as well as for other kind of privacy applications, is that it may be very important to think about how you're pitching that particular application in terms of how you want to talk about privacy and data transparency, or how people might react and be doing some of the calculus of whether or not to adopt things. One person asked in the chat why we chose Louisiana. So we worked with a number of jurisdictions at different phases in their process to kind of help them improve their materials. Louisiana happened to be particularly open to us doing this kind of research study. It actually takes quite a lot of, I think it took 6 months of negotiation with sort of state government and the state health department to get to a situation where we could do this research, release the results publicly, et cetera. And so this was just a jurisdiction that sort of had the resources, the support, the willingness, the desire to do this long of a research study that took about a year versus some of the other jurisdictions that kind of wanted guidance, but weren't really in a position to be research partners with us. One thing I will note about the state of Louisiana is that at least in 2004, which is the last time it was measured, Louisiana was the most collectivist US state. And so one caveat to finding one, which is that the collective good appeal worked better for the COVID apps, is that some of that may be due to the fact that Louisiana is very collectivist, and collectivist cultures tend to care a lot of protecting the in-group and may view sort of their whole state as being an in-group that they want to protect. So I would say, you know, the biggest takeaway here is, yes, a bit about the collective good appeal for contact tracing apps, but mostly about the differential effects of privacy and data transparency statements depending on frame. Okay, so in summary, you know, the takeaway of this work is not just kind of about how we might market COVID apps or how we might have kind of real world impact through this kind of descriptive ethics work, but it's also that responsible data use isn't just about privacy, it's about providing technology that respects users' preferences. And that includes ensuring their data is private, as well as ensuring that when they give up their data, they actually get the benefits that they expected to receive. That means, you know, the app is accurate, it does work the way that we expected, it does do the things that, you know, they signed up for it doing, and not other things that they didn't know it was going to do. And so I think that was something that I at least took away from working in this space, was that there's kind of a broad range of things we should be thinking about when we think about responsible data use and keeping people safe. Thank you, and happy to take additional questions.
Okay, thank you, Elissa. Let's see whether we have questions from the audience. If you want to ask questions, just ask. Okay, so let me ask the first question probably. When you do the study, what kind of privacy mechanisms those apps have, or do they have any differences in privacy protection?
For the field study or for some of the earlier studies?
For the field study, for example.
Yeah, so the field study was a decentralized app built on the Google Apple exposure notification framework, and it was developed by the PathCheck Foundation, which is a foundation that came out of MIT that developed, I think, 12 or more of the US apps. So it's sort of a standard decentralized Google Apple app. There was no sort of nothing special about it. It was just sort of exactly like a canonical Google Apple app.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say, two things. One of them is just what a lovely talk this was, and really informative. So thank you very much, not only for giving the talk, but for doing all this. This is just great. Second thing is, I asked about why you chose Louisiana. I wasn't expecting the kind of answer that you gave. I was expecting something much less interesting. But I think it's really essential to talk about why certain choices were made, and I think the explanation you gave in answering my questions sort of illustrates why it is essential. And I hope that I saw a citation to a DTRAP paper, so I don't know if you put that kind of information in that paper or not, but I think that people who are reading this kind of work need to know why it is that certain decisions were made, because they have vast ramifications.
Yeah, that's a great point. And thank you. It's a really good question. And you're actually, of having given this talk a number of the times, the first person who has asked me that. And I have a social science colleague who writes these books that are like the real story behind the research kind of books. And it makes me think about those and how much context we often miss in papers. So thank you for that question. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Robert, do you want to ask a question? Oh, we can't hear you.
Yeah. Question.
Yeah. We can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, great talk. My question is, I did a little work in this area on contact tracing apps, specifically for Android, and briefly read reviews of them, and there was quite a lot of skepticism, specifically around Google, and specifically even though these people had Android apps, Google's involvement, and I assume something similar on the Apple side. Yeah, people were just broadly skeptical about these specific companies. Did that come through in the research at all, or?
Yes, absolutely. So I'd say this definitely came up in kind of the early work we did on the providers, right? Where we found that, let me get back to that slide. Less than 20%, I want to say it was like 18% of people or something like that, wanted the provider to be a technology company, and very few were only wanting it from a technology company. I think this is an interesting case, and an interesting case of difference, say, between the US and Europe, right? Where in Europe, there were a lot of apps that were developed by, and the infrastructure came from, universities, although that wasn't very popular in the US either, but a little different in Europe. That was quite different than in the US, where basically all of the apps were built on Google Apple framework. And, it's an interesting case of what would we have seen if they had been developed by public health agencies. And that's actually something we studied in a different set of research that I didn't talk about here, but we interviewed folks in Belgium about a year after they had started using the apps. And one of the things that we found was that people who were still using them had switched to using them as test results apps. So they were like, well, I get my test results for my COVID test faster here than I do anywhere else. And if it's positive, then I click the button to send it out to do contact tracing, but really I use it to check COVID stats and get my test results. And what would it have looked like, right? If we had apps that were better integrated in the health system and were pitched as, hey, you can get your test results fast. And if you feel like it and you make the decision at the time, you can do contact tracing. Would that have been more effective? Quite possibly. That requires a very different, sort of infrastructure and model of going about it than what ended up happening, right? Which was completely, in many ways, separate from at least the health system that most people interact with day to day. So I think absolutely that was a big concern. And I think it's something that, folks are thinking about and probably will be thinking more about moving forward, which is if we want to have contact tracing apps more widely available, right, for other kinds of health issues, how should those be part of the health system? Who should they be coming from? Who should be promoting them? And most of the research seems to indicate it should be coming from people's doctors, if there's a national healthcare system, things like that.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right. So I have a question. Do you know what's exactly the privacy concerns people have when they use this type of apps?
Yes, that's a good question. So people have concerns about, so there's a few things. So one is people have sort of general concerns about data breaches. I wouldn't say they have a specific consequence they're thinking about, but I think it's this feeling of lack of control. My data is just, there's a very nicely titled paper from, I think, 2011 that's called My Data Just Goes Everywhere. So basically this sense that my data will go everywhere. In the US, there's certainly concern people have that this data will later be used for insurance pricing, there would be something revealed that might change their insurance pricing. And then there's government surveillance concerns. And we saw, one thing that we see in some different work that we've done actually is that in the US, who has the government surveillance concern changes depending on the political party in power. So the Republican-leaning folks are concerned about government surveillance more so when there's a Democrat in power. Democrat-leaning folks are more concerned about it when there's a Republican-leaning person in power. But that is certainly something that we saw participants mentioning as well.
Okay, right. Another question I have is there are actually a few academic research about using cryptography in this type of application, like they have a decentralized or distributed protocols running on the app, and then all the data are encrypted while it's being processed. So no one can see the raw data, but they can get results. Would this type of things be useful, or will people accept this type of settings?
It's a great question. We actually have a project that we're starting on to look at whether, say, if you have a like a trusted execution environment or a composition of different ones of these kind of encrypted environments, does that make people any more comfortable, right? If I can say these are the only queries that can be performed on your data, or let's say like, you know, if we were using order preserving encryption, right, we might be able to say, well, someone would be able to figure out whether you're older or younger than this age, but they wouldn't know exactly your age. I don't know yet, but we're starting to do some research to find out how people would feel about that, and how people would feel about that in different computational settings, right? So not just kind of healthcare and contact tracing, but some other settings as well.
Yeah.